Birthdays and anniversaries are important for humans, and I think they're important for video games as well. It gives us a chance to look back and reflect on the important games and series that have just made huge impacts not only in your personal life, but in the video game world as a whole. Castlevania just turned 30, and I'm a huge Castlevania fan. So for this video, I wanted to talk briefly about the trilogy of games on the NES, because these three games were some of the most impactful. Whether it was impactful in a positive way or a negative way, the Castlevania trilogy on the NES is arguably one of the finest trilogies on the NES. So without any further ado, let's take a look at Castlevania trilogy on the NES. So of course, the first game in the trilogy is the original Castlevania. This is the game that started it off, this is the game that just turned 30 years old, and this is one of the finest NES games there is. You play as Simon Belmont, and it pretty much set the standard for how the series would play out. It was a 2D platformer with heavy emphasis on action, and they really took a lot from horror movies in this game. You had the bosses that, were Frankenstein and mummies and bats and Dracula, of course, himself, because that's what you're doing. You're invading this castle and trying to defeat Dracula as Simon Belmont. And there was lots of cool bosses, lots of cool enemies, things like the Medusa's heads, as annoying as they were really interesting because you hadn't really seen anything like that on the NES at the time. Castlevania was a very unique specimen when it first came out because it was a darker tone, it wasn't the kiddie Nintendo style that a lot of us, were used to playing, like Super Mario Brothers. This was a dark tone, definitely had a mature edge to it. And just the gameplay is timeless. I mean, it introduced sub-weapons into gaming where Simon could use, a knife, an axe, holy water, or stop time to progress throughout the game, and it was just awesome. Using your whip just felt really solid and natural, and just the level progression was really well done. The castle really felt alive when you were in catacombs in different locations, and of course you have to talk about the music. Castlevania as a series probably has some of the best music of all time. You're actually hearing a rendition of the first Castlevania soundtrack by my buddy, the NES Romancer, in this video. And it's a game that stands the test of time. I mean, I played this a couple nights ago, drunk off my ass, and I had an absolute blast with it. I actually play the game better drunk than I do sober, which makes no sense, but that's neither here nor there. But Castlevania, obviously one of the most impactful games on the NES library, and arguably one of the best games on the NES library. Now you would think after the amazing original Castlevania that Konami would follow it up with a sequel, and of course they did, but it was definitely a sequel that I don't think a lot of people were expecting, and that was Castlevania II: Simon's Quest. A lot of people view this as sort of the bastard child of the trilogy, and I think that's fair because it was very different. Instead of the standard level progression, it was more of an open world atmosphere. And unfortunately, the text and sort of, push along that you needed in this game just wasn't there. There was a lot of cryptic stuff. There was a lot of stuff that, unless you had a copy of Nintendo Power, there was no way you would know where to go or what to do. I do applaud Konami for trying something different, though. It kind of falls into the sequel-itis that plagued, a lot of trilogies on the NES. If you look at The Legend of Zelda, that's probably one of the most polarizing games for Zelda fans. Of course, Super Mario Bros. 2, which was vastly different from Super Mario Bros. 1, and I think Castlevania kind of falls into that. Not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination. It actually introduced one of the finest songs in the Castlevania series, that being Bloody Tears. However, it's just not as good as the other two games because of all the cryptic stuff. You really have to use a FAQ or a guide in order to progress in this game in a timely manner, and that's a shame. And plus, invisible floors and, falling floors and stuff. Castlevania 2, it's not a bad game. I think people give it way too much discredit, but it's definitely not one of the best in the trilogy. It's cheap enough though, and it's the cheapest in the trilogy, so if you absolutely want to complete the trilogy, you can pick up Castlevania 2, but Castlevania 3 was just so much better. And of course, ending things off in the trilogy is Castlevania III: Dracula's Curse, which is considered by many to be one of the best Castlevania games ever, and I agree with that sentiment. Castlevania III: Dracula's Curse felt a lot more like Castlevania 1 as opposed to the strange sort of level development of Castlevania 2. This game did feature branching paths and characters, sub-characters to use, which was really fun. You could switch characters on the fly, and it really added a lot to the gameplay. The branching paths in the game also increased replay value because you wanted to see these other levels. You wanted to see, what was different. And of course, the visuals, The audio are just top notch in this game. Some of the best 8-bit songs, some of the best 8-bit visuals on the NES, and it's just a timeless classic. It's a game that, much like the original Castlevania, you could pop in today and it still feels just as good, just as fresh, and just as challenging as it did when it originally came out. And that's really a testament to the Castlevania series. I think that's why people love Castlevania games, because they never seem to age. You could play Super Castlevania 4, Symphony of the Night, Castlevania 3, original Castlevania, they still feel just as fresh. And this is obviously one of the finest entries of the series, and definitely a fantastic way to end the NES trilogy. So Castlevania obviously is one of my favorite series, and I plan on doing more Castlevania videos because I love Castlevania. Maybe even a top 10 of my favorite Castlevania videos. Tell me what you think of the original trilogy in the comments section below. Which one was your favorite in the original trilogy? What sort of memories you have of it? And of course, thank you for liking this video and subscribing to the channel if you haven't yet. I will catch you guys next time. Later.